Now, this session is Law and Disorder at Mudgee. As I mentioned before, local history never happens in a vacuum, and I'm going to be talking about a few bushrangers. But the thing about bushrangers is everyone's family, if they were living in the area at the time, will probably have a story, whether it's in a diary or not. They'll have a story about the bushranger that almost robbed them, or that they lived down the street or something like this. So I'm going to just talk about some of the bushrangers from the area. And of course, the most famous is Sam Poo, who, according to a website I was looking at for the Gulgong group, is Li Hung Shik. But now I found that photograph in a newspaper called The Queenslander, because the story of Sam Poo, Australia's only Chinese bushranger, gets told and told again. Now, I think the photograph, he's in the shadows. I don't think he's anything like, who knows whether it's the bushranger or not. But of course, as well as bushrangers, we of course had the policeman. And here, sadly, Constable John Ward was killed by Sam Poo. John Ward went out to pursue him. Sam Poo had apparently started life as a gold miner. He was a skilled and elusive bushman, it's described as, active in the Coonabarabran area in the 1860s. He apparently targeted solitary travellers on foot. John Ward was told that a Chinese man who had been robbing passing travellers in the vicinity was nearby in the scrub. So out went John Ward. When Sam Poo saw the policeman, he ran into the bush and the policeman chased him. Sam Poo turned around, shot the constable, mortally wounding him. He didn't die immediately, but he did die. Sam Poo was caught and he himself was shot, trying to escape. Took a long time for him to recover. When he recovered, he was taken to Bathurst and tried, and he was hanged. A couple of things about Sam Poo. When I mentioned it to Carol, actually, she said to me, I wouldn't mind betting that it wouldn't be, he wasn't the only one, and that there were a number of crimes that attributed to him, that whether he committed them or not. And one in particular, there is a suggestion that he raped someone, but there is some doubt about that. However, there's no doubt about the fact that he was hanged, and sadly no doubt about the fact that Constable John Ward died. And there is in fact a memorial to John Ward, killed on duty, and it's got the day that he was shot one day and then died the next day. Now, I mentioned Robert Lowe Senior and Robert Lowe Junior this morning when I was talking about land records. The Lowe family seemed to have a bit of bad luck, well, good luck, bad luck, with bushrangers. Looking at the Colonial Secretary's correspondence between 1788 and 1825, there's lots of references to bushrangers. The term is very old and used widely. A lot of them, of course, were absconding convicts. A lot of them were people who simply, I think, determined that to be a way to make a bit of a quick living. A couple of references that I found which related, and they were comments by Robert Lowe Senior. And in 1822, I mean, we're talking here, 1822 hasn't been very long since they crossed the Blue Mountains. As we know, Robert Lowe was here, as was William Lawson. They had their cattle yards, etc. So they were over here legally over here. But of course, the bushrangers, these people were running around the place illegally and complained about the lack of firearms afforded to the police. Now, there's been quite a lot written about bushrangers in Australia, and there was, I can't think of the fellow's name, it'll come to me in a moment, but he was a bit of a theatrical performer, Edgar Pensy, and he was a bit of a theatrical performer, and he used to write books and he used to do performances all about the evil bushrangers and the honourable policemen. Of course, I'm not taking a view either way, because I think we spend too much time imbuing some of our bushrangers with all kinds of wonderful attributes, and whether they had them or not, I think, is another question altogether. However, here we have in 1822 and again in 1825 complaints because there weren't enough police, police didn't have enough firearms. In 1825, I found this reference to the notorious bushranger William Blackburn. And William Lawson wrote the letter to the Colonial Secretary, and I'm sorry, the handwriting is a little bit difficult to read, but it basically says, I had Mr. Lowe's assistance and we have sentenced him, which is interesting. He was Lawson, of course, was a magistrate, and he received 200 lashes, this fellow, and he was sent to Port Macquarie for the remainder of his sentence. I had a little bit further at William Blackburn, and of course he escaped from Port Macquarie. I don't know what happened to him in the end. So here we have Robert Lowe, thanks to the wonderful newspaper, and the recidivist, John Owens. Owens and Owen, it appears as both. Now, I think everyone is probably familiar with the brave tale of Robert Lowe Jr., and because he was driving along, and you can read it up there, but he was driving along in his buggy, and he was held up by two armed men. And Robert Lowe, and they'd obviously, the Lowe family had had enough of this business with bushrangers, so he picked up his pistol and he shot and fired. One of them was killed, a man called Feather, and he died. But the other one, John Lowe, he escaped, and he was eventually caught. They had Aboriginal trackers, and he was eventually caught 260 miles away. Now, everyone was very, very pleased and complimented Mr. Lowe on his prompt action, and in fact he received a medal in due course. There was an inquest into the death of the fellow Feather, or Heather. Sometimes it appears as Feather, sometimes Heather. He was said to be a sawyer working in the area, and I endeavoured, but without any success, to find out anything about him. He seems to be completely a mystery. Maybe one day something will come up. But again, this was such an important event. This is one of those things. It's almost like, where were you the day you heard that JFK had been shot? This incident, because very highly significant in the history and local history of Mudgee. And it gets repeated in the newspapers. And the wonderful things, and I gather everyone uses Trove, the wonderful Trove. Trove, of course, is not only newspapers, it's photographs, it's books, it's digital copies, it's everything. But the great thing about the newspapers of the day is, this is the Sydney Morning Herald, but it's picked up a story that was written in the Western Post, the local Mudgee newspaper. And it gives quite a good description, and it's quite nice to read, where Lowe responds very quickly. And what I think is interesting is we're far less, in this period of time, people are far franker about different things. But in the description, when they went back to get the body had begun to decompose. And of course, it's reported in the newspaper. There's no mucking around, no niceness about anything. So, however, poor old Feather was dead, and Robert Lowe, the hero of the day. And in fact, this is from the State Library's website, because the medal was donated to the library, presented by one of the Lowe family, the Lowes of Wilbertree. Now, the other bushranger, John Owens, this man would have to be the unluckiest man, but also, in some ways, the lucky, because he seems to have escaped death throughout his life. Now, according to the jail photograph books, he came from Liverpool. The ship that he is said to have come on, I have looked at, he's not listed as a crew member, and it wasn't carrying passengers. So I don't know really how he got here, but he was certainly in Sydney in 1860. And in 1860, he began his life of crime. I have to say that you sort of wonder sometimes about people. He was supposed to have come on this ship called the Louis Napoleon, but of course he didn't. There were three of them, John Daly, John Howe and Mary Jones, plus our friend Owens, and they were tried in the Sydney Quarter Sessions of burglary, entering the Woolloomooloo dwelling house of Thomas Rice, and he received a 9 months sentence for that, and in fact the first week of every month in solitary. So he serves that sentence. Next thing we know, he's robbed the Casillas Mail, and then of course attempts to rob Mr. Lowe. Now he runs away, and then he's convicted for horse stealing. In May, he's convicted and indicted for robbery with firearms. He's in Mudgee jail and escapes from Mudgee jail. He's not the only one to escape from Mudgee jail, so it must have been an easy one to break out of. Recaptured fairly soon afterwards. So on the 29th of June, he's sentenced for 14 years. Now, that was hard labour. And he's initially sent to Berrima Jail. In 1866, for some reason, they decide to move him and a group of other convicts, or prisoners, I should say, more precisely, from Berrima Jail, all of them serving long sentences. And they were going to be moved to Darlinghurst. They were accompanied by police, and they were put on a Cobb and Co coach, apparently. They stopped for a bit, and one of the prisoners decided that he'd try and escape. There was a tussle, and one of the policemen was killed. He received a life sentence for that. He was very, very fortunate. He was still quite a young man. The newspaper account says he was 16, but actually I think closer to being in his early 20s. What happened, they decided, and the Executive Council considered this because he was convicted initially of murder, was resolved as Cookwell, who was one of the prisoner, had fired the fatal shot to execute him. And he was hanged in Darlinghurst Jail on the 2nd of July 1866. A difficulty arose with regard to the degree of punishment to be meted out to his 5 accomplices. None of them fired, but Cookwell. And as Owens and Weaver were only 16 years old, well, that, as I said, wasn't true. That afforded an additional reason for remission of the dread penalty, i.e. death. On the other hand, most of them had 7 or 8 years imprisonment to undergo, and hence life imprisonment would not be so dreadful in addition to their punishment. Finally, it was resolved to imprison them in irons for the term of their natural life, and the minute of the Executive Council expressed a determination that they never be released until death should legally end the imprisonment. Now, after some years, the prisoners petitioned to have their fetters removed, and the request was agreed to. Later still, several members of Parliament, including Mr John Hurley, who I don't know much about, he obviously felt that there was some action needed to be taken, interceded on their behalf and pointed out the immense duration of their punishment. The agitation had at length succeeded and the newspaper account is dated on the 21st of May 1881. For this week, 3 of the men were released and the other 2 to be discharged in the course of a few weeks. So, out he comes, he's out of jail. Next thing we know, he's attempted to break into the house of Mr J.W. Nixon in 1882. He gets another 15 years. And here we have the description. This is taken from the newspaper. I used the transcription and fixed it up a bit from the Trove, because when they reported this, they actually reported that it was the same Owens who had taken part in the Bargo Brush outrage. So there he was. You just can't believe it, really. Oh, it was awful. But amazingly, we do have a photograph, and on the documentation, which is this is the jail photograph description book for Berrima Jail. The annotation is dated the 23rd of November 1882, and you can see that he has worked 20 years on the roads, and as we know, much of that in irons. Quite extraordinary. I mean, he's not one of those famous bushrangers, not surprisingly. And in fact, looking at him, he looks pretty pathetic. I think he died in Parramatta at the invalid establishment, not the mental hospital, but the asylum for the infirm and destitute in the 1890s. I'm not surprised. But of course, Robert Lowe has a wonderful headstone. So he had lived a very safe life and a lucky life.